Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. Let's jump straight into it, because the biggest story right now is that the US and Iran have once again stepped back from the edge, but they are not actually stepping away from the fight underneath it. After days of strikes across the Gulf and surrounding theaters, both sides have agreed to halt immediate hostilities and return to technical talks tied to their interim understanding. The language from U.S. officials is careful. It's a pause, not a resolution. Iran, for its part, has not fully confirmed the stand down in the same way and continues to double down on its core position. It sees itself as the central authority over the Strait of Hormuz and the flow of global shipping through it. That right there is the core tension driving everything else. Because what looks like a ceasefire on paper is really a disagreement over who gets to control one of the most important maritime choke points in the world. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional waterway, it's the valve for global energy markets. And right now, both Washington and Tehran are trying to define the rules of the system while simultaneously testing how far they can push those rules without triggering a wider war. And here's where things get very real. Even as diplomacy resumes, the cycle of attacks that led to this pause is still fresh. Iranian-linked strikes have targeted commercial shipping moving through or near the strait, including tankers carrying massive crude shipments. The U.S. response has been direct. Air and missile strikes hitting Iranian surveillance infrastructure, drone storage facilities, communications nodes, and systems tied to mining and maritime disruption capability along the coast. So what you've got is not de-escalation in the traditional sense. It's more like both sides agreeing to stop swinging for a moment while they reset their footing. Now zoom out to the economic layer, because this is where the global stakes become obvious. Oil markets have been riding a roller coaster. Prices spiked when shipping lanes were threatened, then eased when the stand down was announced, then immediately recalibrated again because traders are basically watching the Strait of Hormuz like it's a live wire hanging over the entire global economy. Brent crude and WTI both stabilized after the announcement, but analysts are still flagging a heavy risk premium. Translation: nobody actually believes this is settled. And that uncertainty is the point. Iran's leverage in this entire situation is not conventional military dominance. It's disruption capacity. If shipping slows, insurance rates jump. If insurance jumps, supply chains tighten. If supply chains tighten, global inflation pressure creeps back in. It's a cascading system, and Tehran knows exactly how sensitive it is. Now let's talk about the Gulf states, because they are no longer just observers in this. They are now directly inside the pressure envelope. Iran launched missile and drone attacks targeting U.S.-linked facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait during the latest escalation cycle. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which immediately elevates the strategic weight of any strike in that area. Kuwait, meanwhile, intercepted incoming ballistic threats. Damage reports vary, but the signal is consistent. Iran is willing to extend retaliation beyond maritime space into Gulf territory when it wants to raise the cost of U.S. action. This is where things get interesting from a signaling standpoint. Iran is not just responding to strikes, it's communicating to regional governments that alignment with U.S. maritime enforcement efforts carries direct risk. That creates a second-order pressure campaign aimed at Gulf decision-making, not just U.S. forces. And while this is happening, diplomacy is still trying to operate in parallel. The U.S.-Iran memorandum framework that sits underneath all of this is supposed to cover a 60-day negotiation window. It includes the idea of reopening shipping lanes, defining how maritime traffic is managed, and eventually moving toward broader talks that include nuclear constraints and sanctions relief. But both sides are now actively interpreting that same document in opposite ways. The U.S. sees it as guaranteeing freedom of navigation. Iran reads it as validating its role as the primary manager of the strait. That divergence is not a footnote. It is the entire problem. Now shift to Lebanon, because this is where the regional architecture starts to stack together. A U.S.-brokered framework between Israel and Lebanon is supposed to create pilot zones in southern Lebanon, where the Lebanese armed forces gradually take over security responsibilities from Israeli forces. The idea is phased stabilization. Lebanese forces move in, armed groups are disarmed, and Israeli forces reposition out of certain areas. But on the ground, the political reaction has been immediate resistance. Hezbollah has rejected the agreement outright, framing it as a surrender arrangement rather than a stabilization plan. Its leadership is warning that implementation could trigger internal conflict inside Lebanon. Nabi Berri, one of the most influential Lebanese political figures aligned with Hezbollah's broader bloc, has gone further, calling the agreement externally imposed and warning it could fracture Lebanese society. Meanwhile, Israel is continuing kinetic operations regardless of the diplomatic framework. Strikes against Hezbollah infrastructure have included underground tunnel systems, weapons storage sites, and armed personnel encounters in southern Lebanon. Even after agreements are signed, the operational tempo hasn't slowed in a meaningful way. So what you're seeing in Lebanon is a parallel track problem. Diplomacy is trying to draw lines on a map. Military reality is still actively reshaping those same lines. Now bring Iraq into the picture, because it shows how influence is evolving rather than disappearing. Iran-linked political and militia networks inside Iraq appear to be adapting under U.S. pressure. Reporting indicates that some groups are considering formally separating political wings from armed wings while simultaneously increasing their ability to influence state institutions from within. That means less visible militia branding, more integration into government structures, procurement systems, and civil service positions. In other words, influence is not being reduced. It is being rerouted. At the same time, Iraqi authorities have launched corruption and financial enforcement actions that include dozens of arrests. There are also broader reform efforts underway tied to anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing standards. U.S. engagement is clearly pushing hard on institutional pressure points rather than purely military ones, aiming to weaken the financial and administrative ecosystem that supports armed networks. And then there is the cyber layer, which is running completely parallel to everything else. Israeli cyber authorities report a sharp surge in Iranian cyber operations against Israeli targets. We're talking about thousands of incidents in a single month, targeting everything from government infrastructure to private companies and professional services firms. Even when critical infrastructure holds, softer targets are getting hit, disrupted, or wiped. This matters because cyber operations don't pause when ceasefires are declared. There is no equivalent of a hotline that shuts down intrusion campaigns. So even while diplomats talk about de-escalation, digital pressure continues at scale, shaping intelligence collection, disruption capacity, and signaling behavior. Thanks for listening and for being part of this community. If you want to support the show, leaving a review or a thoughtful comment helps others discover it. We also share a daily written intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia and China, along with broader coverage of Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Wishing you a great week ahead.